So our next presenter is Dr. Ian Cook. Ian is with the Grassland Conservation Manager with Birds Canada. I think when it comes to grassland ecosystems, birds are probably the #1 indicator species that are used. And probably more scientific papers published on that than any other indicator species in terms of assessing grassland ecosystem health. So Ian, please go ahead and tell us about the interactions between birds as indicators representing impacts in the agricultural working landscape.
Great, thank you very much, Tim. I'll see if I can get my screen shared and look for a thumbs up from somebody when it's working. So just wait a second.
Yeah, it's there. You just need to convert to slideshow. Perfect. You got it.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I am actually not a doctor, but thank you, Tim, for the compliment. So you're going to get a very much a layman's term sort of perspective here, but thank you for the opportunity to speak on grassland birds and birds as indicators and some of our work on using birds as indicators to represent impacts in the ag working landscape. So before I start, though, I'd like to just take a quick moment to acknowledge that Birds Canada, our work on the Canadian prairies takes place on Treaty 1, Treaty 2, Treaty 4, Treaty 6 lands, and on the traditional territories of the Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Métis, Blackfoot, Stoney, Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla people. And as an organization, Birds Canada understands that Indigenous voices, knowledge, and ongoing work on the land are critical for wild birds to thrive in sustainable ecosystems, and we really support the needs, aspirations, and rights of Indigenous people to care for the land. So thought I would start the first part of my presentation. Oh, I think maybe you might be seeing that, so I'll get that out of the way.
No, we're good.
Okay. I thought I would start the first part of my presentation sort of addressing the overarching question of the session this afternoon, and is biodiversity the new carbon? And I thought I'd start by looking at the impact of agriculture on biodiversity, which Majid and Sarah have done a really good job of laying out as well. So again, you're going to get sort of the layman's perspective on that from me. But we do know that obviously agriculture has a major impact on biodiversity, and thus has a lot of potential to, or has enormous potential to be a positive impact on biodiversity and to contribute to the solutions that are facing biodiversity loss. If we focus in on sort of the Northern Great Plains and the Canadian prairies and focus on what we deal with birds, many of the species that are endemic to this biome of the Northern Great Plains now rely on agricultural working landscapes, and their populations have declined precipitously. For instance, if we look at grassland birds and aerial insectivores, they've declined more rapidly than any other group in Canada, having lost nearly 60% each of their populations since 1970. Those largest declines have been seen by those birds that rely explicitly on native prairie, which have declined nearly 90%. But even if we dig into the data and we look at that, even birds that can tolerate those agricultural altered landscapes have also declined by nearly 40%. So these declines are largely the result of agricultural practices, whether that's natural habitat conversion or practices that diminish insect prey in the context of aerial insectivores. Agriculture obviously has a large impact. If we look more at this chart, though, there are some good news stories in this chart as well. We see that birds of prey have increased by a lot since the 1970s, and a lot of that has to do with the discontinuation of the use of DDT. Waterfowl have also increased, and that's a testament to some really effective conservation efforts that have gone on since 1970. Within those increases, there are certainly species that aren't doing so well and are decreasing, like northern pintails and ferruginous hawks that really rely on those grasslands. But it does serve as an example of the positive impact that agriculture can have on biodiversity when we set our minds to doing that. So that's sort of the impact on impact of agriculture on biodiversity. But what impact does biodiversity have on agriculture? And Sarah and Majid touched on this as well. But just to build on their talks, the biodiversity is documented to significantly contribute to agricultural resilience and stability. And as Ortiz and Sarah and Majid all point out, biodiversity and nature is essential to agriculture. It underpins all of the functions and services that are essential to agriculture. So building in biodiversity and working to halt and reverse biodiversity loss will also build in resilience to climate change into our agricultural system. So getting back to that overarching question, is biodiversity the new carbon? Obviously, there's been a lot of focus on carbon over the last several years, and rightfully so. Climate change is an important threat to biodiversity and to our ag system. But there is growing evidence and recognition that we must address climate change and biodiversity loss together. And one of the best ways to do this is through nature-based solutions, which again, ag has tremendous opportunity to contribute to. These nature-based solutions deliver broad benefits to the society and economy. And again, as Sarah and Majid point out, there's evidence to suggest that we can do an even better job of mitigating climate change and adapting to its impacts if we include a focus on biodiversity within those nature-based solutions. And that's partly because biodiversity almost always delivers other ecological goods and services like carbon sequestration and water quality. But according to McFadden et al., it's not always necessarily the other way around, that focusing on carbon delivers those biodiversity benefits. So encouraging systems that foster biodiversity, we also produce a number of ecological goods and services like water quality, erosion control, and carbon sequestration. We look at a Canadian specific example. Drever et al. Shows that keeping grasslands intact is actually the best natural climate solution available in Canada. So this is an ag working landscape that has the best potential as a nature-based solution for mitigating climate change and thinking about all of the different ecological goods and services that are embedded within that grassland, with the wetlands that are so biodiverse and the water quality and soil erosion control that those things all provide. And then also protecting and keeping intact one of the most at-risk and least protected biomes on the planet, which is the temperate grasslands. All of those things are kind of wrapped up within that particular nature-based solution. So increasingly, it seems like from my perspective, by no means a global markets expert or anything, but seems to be increasingly governments and corporations around the world are recognizing the need to address climate change and biodiversity loss together, that the loss of biodiversity and nature really creates systemic economic risk across our economy. So some of the examples that evidence this are some of the commitments made at COP15, including mobilizing $200 billion in biodiversity-related funding from both private and public sectors, the commitments and goals that Sarah mentioned through the Green Agricultural Plan, the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership, the Guelph Statement, which specifically mentions a goal to improve biodiversity and protect sensitive habitats. Those are all examples coming just from our federal and provincial governments. From the more private side, there are a growing number of companies that have biodiversity targets to achieve before 2030. And again, at COP15, there were over 300 businesses and financial institutions that had over $1.5 trillion of revenues that all said, including Nestle, McCain's, Danone, these agri-food corporations, they all are saying that we need a way to be able to require mandatory requirements for large businesses and financial institutions to assess but also disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature by 2030. So we have huge multinational corporations that represent a huge amount of revenue saying that this is important to our risk and to our economic model, and we need to be able to disclose our impacts and our risk on that. So all of this is just to say that there does seem to be growing recognition that given that half of our world's economic output is directly dependent on nature, that the loss of biodiversity means that there's significant risk for our economy and especially for our food system. So for these companies with agri-food supply chains, it will be necessary for them to measure and communicate biodiversity impacts through that sort of scope 3 mechanism right down to the primary production at a producer level. But despite all of this, despite the urgent need and awareness to address biodiversity loss, biodiversity remains an externality in our Canadian agricultural system. Those traditional commodity outputs from ag production are priced by our markets, dollars per bushel of wheat, dollars per pound of beef. In those markets, biodiversity is excluded, and the costs of diminishing biodiversity are not necessarily part of that direct economic transaction. So without having an immediately tangible economic benefit to sustaining biodiversity, it often gets ignored by most production decisions. And so developing policy and market tools to transition biodiversity from an externality to important economic output of our agricultural system may help producers internalize biodiversity as an output, much like they've done with commodity yields and have done an excellent job of increasing production over the last 50 years. So I actually, in watching Dr. Henry Jansen and Tim's keynote address, Dr. Jansen pointed out that he identified that the reimagining of our agriculture economics is one of the fundamental restructurings that needs to occur in order to approach net zero. And from my perspective, I think the same is true for biodiversity because they're so closely intertwined. And we need to recognize that complex landscapes that Sarah was describing, biodiversity and other EG&S make our ag system more resilient and provide significant public benefit. And I really liked the quote that Dr. Jansen had from Bradford and Lawrence et al. We need to stop seeing ag as an industrial commodity producing sector and acknowledge its fundamental role in ensuring human nourishment and well-being. And an effective way to sort of look at this and shift biodiversity from externality to part of the economic transaction is through potentially outcome-based approaches to biodiversity conservation. But as Majid pointed out, finding suitable biodiversity indicators are challenging, and these biodiversity indicators are going to be necessary if we are wanting to move biodiversity from an externality to being part of the economic output of our ag system. So we need something that is going to connect on the ground management to those supply chains, and we need indicators that are going to be actionable and measure progress towards sustainability goals and are going to be of interest to companies and consumers, and therefore facilitate that increased compensation for producers on the basis of these sustainable outcomes, as according to Herling et al. So in short, how do we ensure we are capturing and thus able to reward those societal benefits that are being provided by producers? So that kind of gives you a bit of an idea of how we're sort of coming at this a little bit. And of course, Sarah and Michelle did a good job of pointing that out. But so from a Birds Canada perspective, we recognize these challenges and how do we sort of contribute to addressing some of these, because agriculture is having such an important impact for birds. So how can we address some of the risk and revenue gaps that exist, and how can we contribute to halting and reversing conversion of grasslands and halting and reversing biodiversity loss? And we recognize that actually the things that are near and dear to our hearts as an organization, birds, have numerous characteristics that, as Tim mentioned, lend themselves to being an important component of a biodiversity indicator. Birds are a significant and sensitive component of the biodiversity in the ag working landscape. And while they're not going to be, as Majid pointed out, they're not going to be representative of all biodiversity, they are good indicators of overall ecosystem health. We also have good long-term trend data and well-developed repeatable methods of detecting birds. They're more cost efficient to monitor than a lot of other taxa, which is important for scalability. And again, many birds, especially those of high conservation value or are species at risk, require those natural habitats which are carbon rich. And then they're also good for storytelling. They have a lot of high public resonance, as sort of evidenced by even our organization's 70,000 plus supporters that support our organization. So all of this sort of led us down the road to looking into something called the Bird Friendliness Index. So this is an outcome-based indicator that represents the impact, that's designed to represent the impact of management on a bird community. And typically that's done at a farm or ranch level. So this was originally developed by a group of researchers led by Nicole Michel at the Audubon Society. And we've been working for the last 2 years to looking at adapting and developing this to the Canadian prairie context, and looking at this as a potential tool for producers, conservation organizations, regulatory bodies to be able to measure the impact that management is having on birds and by extension biodiversity as represented by the bird community, and be able to, again, communicate that impact to stakeholders throughout a supply chain and maybe contribute to enabling some of those market and policy tools to provide that fair compensation for the biodiversity that producers are providing. I'll go over some of the key components of the Bird Friendliness Index. And if there are more questions about sort of the more nuts and bolts of how it works, I'm happy to answer those afterwards. But just to give you a high level overview of how it works, this is an outcome-based indicator that uses only bird data inputs. So there's no sort of habitat modeling or anything. It's using the birds as those outcomes. And as it was originally designed by Audubon and Dr. Michel, it has 3 main inputs. Simplified, it's some weighted densities of the birds that are detected on a farm or ranch multiplied by the functional diversity of those birds that are found. So this sort of takes into 3 main components. How many birds are there? They're then weighted by the conservation need or value of those birds. So birds that are species at risk are going to receive a higher weighting than birds that are more common, but it does use a cross section of the bird community that's found on a farm or ranch. And then it also looks at the bird diversity that's there as well. So, and then this is measured at a farm scale, and the Bird Friendliness Index is then rescaled and presented as a number between 0 and 1. And in general, as you approach 1, the better the conditions are for birds on that farm. The background bird community is represented by a 0.5, and that represents the average in the landscape. So anything, if Cook Farms is receiving anything above a 0.5, then that means that I'm above average for birds in my sort of surrounding landscape, in my business as usual that's going on. So, and then, so this notion of comparing to what's going on in the surrounding landscape and the standardization is an important component of the Bird Friendliness Index. So it is standardized relative to the surrounding landscape in order to achieve that relative comparison between what's going on a farm and what's going on in the surrounding landscape. So the farms that we're measuring Bird Friendliness Index on have bird data collected on them to represent the bird community on the farm. But we're then using bird data sources to also represent the bird community in the surrounding agricultural landscape. And these surrounding lands serve to represent the background bird community condition that's going on within that year in the surrounding landscape. So that surrounding landscape is then always represented by a 0.5, representing the average. So this standardized, and then a farm or ranch is going to receive a score relative to 0.5. Again, above 0.5 is indicating above average. Below 0.5 is going to indicate that there's maybe some work to be done to improve the conditions for birds on those places. So the standardization is designed to mitigate some effects that may affect birds that are outside of a land manager's control. For instance, a farm or ranch won't be penalized for natural population declines due to drought conditions, as those drought conditions will likely be affecting bird communities in the surrounding stratum in similar ways. So this results in an effective relative comparison between what's going on the farm and what's going on in the surrounding landscape to home in on the impact that management systems are having upon the bird communities on those farms, and also gives us an effective approach to communicating impacts by being able to say that a farm is providing biodiversity benefits above and beyond what the average or the business as usual is in the surrounding landscape. And the other thing that this does is that through the standardization and effectively stratifying and making sure that we're being thoughtful on how you're comparing the farm to the surrounding landscape, this makes it the BFI regionally contextualized, meaning that it is adaptable and should be meaningful across the working landscape and production type. So it's not necessarily specific to a production type and could be used in a number of different ways. So how do we go about collecting the bird data through? Over the last 2 years, we've been working to develop this, and as part of this, we have to go out and we do bird surveys. So just to give you an idea of how we actually do this, when we go to a farm, we're aiming to get a representative sample of each farm, and that ranges depending on what the size of the farm is. So we have two different methods to collect data: the more traditional in-person point count method, where we're sending qualified personnel out to detect the birds that are on these farms and ranches. And we're also using autonomous recording units, largely as a way to scale our effort. This allows us to still do work on days that weather isn't conducive to doing point counts and all those sorts of things, and is also contributing to giving us some additional data as well, being able to have recordings for times that we wouldn't have people normally out there. So, but those are sort of the two main methods. And through our work to develop the BFI, we've conducted surveys over the last 2 years representing over 340,000 acres of the ag working landscape in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan. One of the other upsides of an approach like this that is on the ground based and farm level based is that it also provides opportunities to engage producers with the birds that we find on their land. And from our perspective, it provides a really great opportunity to learn from the producers that we're working with, and for the producers to learn more about the biodiversity and the birds that call their land home. So we're able to sit down and engage producers with these birds, share some ID information, life cycle information, some best management practices, all those sorts of things about some of the birds that we find. So what is our sort of end goal with this? And as you know, I think we're looking to contribute to being able to represent biodiversity on these farms or ranches, again, to be able to enable those sorts of policy tools, market tools that will reward biodiversity. So really looking to serve as an indicator for producers, land managers, sustainability initiatives, all enabling them to quantify and evaluate the impact that management and stewardship is having upon birds as an indicator of biodiversity. And then also providing that indicator to gauge outcomes and track progress towards sustainability goals so that producers, corporations, consumers, regulatory agencies alike can then track their progress, and in doing so, enable those market and policy tools. So some current applications of the bird friendliness index, as I mentioned, this was developed by Dr. Michel at the National Audubon Society in the US, and they use it to really evaluate some of the practices that are being implemented as part of their conservation ranching initiative. This is an initiative that now has over 100 ranches and 2.5 million acres under this conservation ranching initiative. And they use it as a way to evaluate, but also to engage those producers that are participating in their Audubon certified land labeling, and be able to engage those producers and saying the things that you're doing are having this benefit to birds, and also engaging those consumers and being able to communicate the positive things that are going on for birds, and that their dollars are contributing to something that is really meaningful to grassland bird conservation. We also had the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef has recently adopted the Bird Friendliness Index within their framework, and certified producers can choose to have the surveys required for the Bird Friendliness Index done on their properties as a way to fulfill a portion of their biodiversity requirements, and in a similar way to the way that Audubon is using it, provide an engagement tool for the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef and its producers to communicate those good news stories and the benefits to their customers. And again, as Dr. Jansen pointed out in his presentation, we need ways to tell better stories. And I think that this is a good vehicle to tell those stories through birds, and tell the story of sustainability really through something that's near and dear to a lot of people's hearts in birds. So we understand that, you know, coming up with a biodiversity indicator that's going to represent everything is very challenging. But we are encouraged by some of the recommendations that were put forward by a report by Crowther et al., and that we need something that's granular, that can be used at a project level, something that's going to be standardized in what it measures. It's going to be robust enough to make comparisons over time, and is going to be able to be scaled across multiple project locations, but is also going to be able to be easily communicated to a wide variety of stakeholders. And really, these things have been driving our development of the Bird Friendliness Index, and we think that it does tick a lot of these boxes and does have a lot of potential to be able to be applied within a biodiversity indicator setting. So next steps for us in terms of development of this is we're going to continue to do the development and analytical work to ensure that this is going to be something that's robust and could be used within a biodiversity indicator framework, or be used more widely across the Canadian prairies context, and continue implementation with the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and really continue to seek applications and continue to learn and improve the Bird Friendliness Index so that it could play a role in incentivizing biodiverse production systems and halting and reversing biodiversity loss within our agricultural working landscape. So with that, I will say thank you very much. And I do want to just take a moment to say thank you to our funding partners that are listed there. I also want to say thank you to the Canadian Wildlife Service, Janine McManus and Barry Robinson, who have done a lot of, who we work quite closely with in order to do the analytical work that's needed here to develop an indicator such as this. And without the folks that are funding us and without a lot of help from a lot of people, this wouldn't be possible. So thank you to everyone that's been involved with this project. And thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about it today.
Thanks very much for that, Ian. So I don't know, we could take a brief break here. We've been going for a while and maybe people need to just stretch out a little bit in that. So why don't we take a 5-minute break just to get people a chance to go and do some relaxation for a little bit here, and then we'll start again at I've got about say 2:15. Does that work for everybody? Let's try that. We'll have the panel discussion at that time.